Can you explain a bit more about this part, a fascinating part in Pakistan saga?
The British had no intelligence connection with the Ministry of Intelligence in Tehran, but they knew that the Directorate of Inter-Service Intelligence in Pakistan did have a connection with the MIS.
At the time of the Al-Haq.
At the time of Al-Haq, this was in 1983, and the information was passed to Tehran through the ISI acting as an intermediary. They were pleased because they were satisfied. They received an assurance that the information was authentic, and the information was attributed to Kozichkin, who had been given the task by his resident, Shabashin, to run the plot, make contact with the Tudor military organization, and engineer the coup. So this benefited everybody except for the Tudor party.
So according to you, there were not any direct connection between Iranian intelligence service and the British intelligence service?
That's correct, at that time.
Let me ask you about another Iranian figure in your studies. You had a book called Friends, and in part of that you talked about the 1953 coup in Iran and some Iranian figures, including Sir Shahpur reporter. Can you tell us about your writings and knowledge about him?
Well, I haven't studied his case, but he was a well-known British agent, and he's a good example of somebody who was hiding in plain sight. He was very obvious. He was an arms dealer in the great tradition of some of the famous arms dealers of the Middle East.
Yes.
He took commissions, and he was a British intelligence agent. But what made him interesting, and is mentioned to this day in training exercises, because he was never paid. So he was a British agent working for the British Secret Intelligence Service, and he was rewarded with a knighthood. And he valued his knighthood more than any material reward that any other intelligence agency might have been able to give him. So,
but he gained millions of pounds from his commissions from military contracts.
Yes, but he would have done anyway. But what's interesting is that we didn't have to pay him.
Was it possible without being part of the intelligence service?
He was never an officer of the Secret Intelligence Service.
But he was confident.
He was an agent.
Yes.
He may have known senior officers, and usually an agent will only know their current case officer, who will rotate. There will be every 2 years you'll get a new case officer.
Let's put it this way. When I read the 1970s documents on British-Iranian relations, in military contracts, both sides, the Shah himself and the British companies, and as well as the MOD, Minister of Defense and Foreign Office, insist that reporter must be in the negotiations, including with the Shah, as a person both sides trust him. And this is one. And the second thing, he was possibly the only or one of the few people who were used to brief any foreign or Western diplomats or official who wanted to go to Iran, high-ranking, not everyone, to Iran, to brief about Iran and teach them about how to do Iran in Iran.
Well, he remains a star agent. He remains in the literature and no doubt in the records as being a classic example of somebody who knew everybody, was a Mr. Fix-It. He was able to participate, advise, recommend, and he was an invaluable asset for the British intelligence service without ever having to be paid a penny by them.
Yeah, but I don't know whether you're aware of that or not. In late 70s, before revolution, it was a very controversial court case against two British military officers who've been bribed or take money for Iranian contracts. and that was very important. One of them was Mark Randall, if I remember his Colonel Mark Randall. And the third part of this court case was reported, but the British government stopped his name to become in the court and mentioned an Iranian said as well, General Tufanian, who was the head of the Iranian military business, any business or military.
This litigation was in England or
in England,
really?
And a few files in the file.
Yes,
and they had to announce every single penny reporter took was the part of the contract.
Sounds like a good book.
Yes. Yeah, it can be. I've got the whole documents if you like. The other thing is I want to ask you about this issue that in the book you recently published called The Compromise Conspiracy, you wrote about the truth about the Trump dossier. First of all, can you tell us about what is the Trump dossier and what is your contribution in this book?
Some years ago now, a former British intelligence officer called Christopher Steele, who I happened to know, and I'd known for some years, was hired in the private sector to investigate Donald Trump and to get information that could be used against him in the election. This much is acknowledged, and there was an intermediary in Washington who hired him on behalf of the Democratic National Committee. That's all very straightforward. He produced a series of reports over a period of about 16 months, which were very damaging to Trump, making various allegations, including his involvement with prostitutes at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow at a particular time. And when these documents became public knowledge in 2016, they, of course, were extremely controversial. And at that time, a few months later, I was hired by a Washington lawyer to write a counterintelligence analysis of the documents. So I was asked to read the documents, the redacted version of the documents, and then to give an analysis and an assessment of the documents. So I read the documents, and it became quite clear to me that Chris Steele had been reliant on about 6 sub-sources for the various different items of information that he had put together in these reports. And he referred to them as source A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And I just simply undertook a very straightforward professional analysis of the document.
How?
And by having all the sources on one side and then pointing out, identifying the specific information attributed to each particular source. And I noticed something very peculiar. There was a source F who appeared to be a middle-ranking member of the management of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and they were authenticating the existence and the employment of somebody else in the hotel who was source G. So I looked at the information that was attributed to source F, and their sole function appeared to be to confirm the existence of source G in the hotel. But what struck me as very odd was that in another report later on, a few months later, the same source G is attributed with information about money laundering operations conducted in Florida by a Russian or Russians employed by the consulate in Florida. Now that struck me as quite odd that a Russian employee of a hotel in Moscow would know about money laundering operations in Florida. So that was the second item that was attributed to this single source. And then I discovered that there is a reference, several references, to a cyber warfare expert who knows about cyber attacks around the world that have been coordinated by the Russians. And that's the same source. So we're being asked to believe that an employee of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow, who has access to the chambermaids and the changing of sheets on beds, and understands the staff of the hotel, and we know from source F that this individual is employed in the hotel. This person also happens to be an expert on cyber warfare around the world, and then knows about very secret operations, money laundering operations conducted in Florida, where incidentally there is not, nor has there ever been, a Russian consulate. So I realized that this was a problem. Because I had written 2 books then about fake spies and about people getting their facts wrong, I recognized a problem. And that is that liars, when interrogated by the police, are asked to repeat their story over and over again. Because if it didn't really happen, at some stage they will make a mistake and they get it wrong in their head about what they said they had done at a particular place at a particular time. And it's a mistake that I recognized in this so-called Trump dossier. And looking at that, I then began to look at the other information and realized that the whole document was a fabrication. And I put this in the private report to the lawyers in Washington, D.C. I have no idea who their client was. I wasn't interested. That was part of the arrangement with the lawyer. But when it emerged subsequently that Chris Steele had been fired, had been supplying information to the FBI, and then had been fired because he'd exaggerated his role in SIS and had been caught out in a lie, I asked the lawyer that I had submitted the document to, would it be possible for me to use this separately? And he said, we have no further use for it. Your report has been overtaken by events. Feel free to use it. And that became my book, The Compromise Conspiracy. But it was that simple mistake of attributing 3 completely different areas of expertise to the same person. It was impossible.
Yeah, one source. But perhaps everyone knows that there are different cases of allegations against Trump to be involved in with Russians.
Oh, I have no doubt that Trump has a murky past. That's not what I'm saying. Personally, I think it's very likely that the Deutsche Bank loans that we know about now that were given to Trump as investments for his real estate business contain dirty money. I think that that's a very strong possibility. But there is also, in the Democratic National Committee's enthusiasm to obtain dirt on Trump, they associated him with one particular person who was described as a crook of Russian background and a well-known criminal. And it subsequently turned out that this individual actually had been an informant for the FBI and the CIA over a very long period and had been very brave and actually far from being a hoodlum who should never have had anything to do with Trump, was in fact a very considerable asset.
What about Russian involvement in the election?
Well, I have no doubt at all that the Russians interfered with in the election. And we know that because I think there were 6.5 million fake Facebook accounts that were created, these fake appointments for demonstrations and so on. We know all of that went on. What nobody can say is to produce somebody who said, guess what, I was going to vote for Hillary. And when I read the negative reporting on her on Facebook, I voted for Trump. Or the other way around, because there appears to have been an almost equal amount of campaigning in the opposite direction. So my impression is that this was a manifestation of the proclivity of Russians to interfere in things. The intelligence community in Moscow is very opportunistic, and I think that they saw an opportunity to interfere. But was there a big master plan? You'd have to pay me to write a report on that. But all that I can tell you is that the Steele dossier is not what it claims to be.
Speaking about Russians and Soviet time and post-Soviet time, if someone look at your books, people can find some titles which shows sort of side taking against Russians, which I think is not always the case. But for example, using words like humiliation in one of your books, which it tries to imply a specific message. Some people think about that. Can you explain that to you?
The senior leadership of the Kremlin is very much KGB dominated.
Still.
Vladimir Putin was himself an intelligence officer. He was in the first chief directorate of the KGB, and he was based in Germany. And he speaks fluent German. And much of his experience and his judgment and his colleagues were people that he knew at that time. And his behavior reflects that. And the behavior of the senior management of the Kremlin suggests that these are people who are well educated, who came from a privileged background, who shared an intelligence interest and worked overseas. And so they have a very close connection with the SVR. And if I was to say to you that the SVR operated in North America over a very long period with a huge network of illegals, that wouldn't come as a surprise to you, because the Kremlin, by convention, has always enjoyed having good intelligence tentacles across the globe. And there is a tendency in the Russian mind.
In both period of Soviets and Russians.
Yes. And there is a tendency for the Russians to prefer information from a clandestine source than an open source. They distrust open sources for obvious reasons. It's easier to manipulate. So you have a scenario where the Kremlin is heavily dependent on its intelligence community. And then to discover that for the past 10 years, your principal network in the United States has been compromised, has been the subject of surveillance, that all the members have been known, they've been photographed, they've been monitored, their homes have been entered, their communications have been interfered with, their stashes of past messages have been decrypted and read. That is a shattering blow. Then to discover that the two really senior officers who were trusted in Moscow, Alexander Poteyev and Alexander Shcherbakov, were actually long-term CIA assets who had to be exfiltrated the same weekend that the 10 illegals in the United States were arrested. How would you describe that? A failure, a disaster, a humiliation. And the real humiliation is then to discover that you have just participated in a false trade, that you've been talked into an exchange, the release of those 10 prisoners in the United States for 4 prisoners in Moscow, 4 Russians. And these 4 Russians, and it's important to say that they're not Americans, they're not British, they're Russian nationals, are being sent overseas. And then for them to realize that one of them was a master spy.
Just last week, President Barack Obama and his Russian counterpart, Dmitry Medvedev, were smiling over burgers, a sure sign that relations between the two nations had come a long way. But a case unfolding along the East Coast sounds like a chapter out of the Cold War. 10 Russian intelligence officers have been arrested, allegedly for spying on the U.S. The suspects appeared in federal courts in New York, Boston, and Alexandria, Virginia Monday, one day after FBI agents showed up at each of their homes. This photo shows FBI agents in Montclair, New Jersey. 2 of the suspects live here, apparently with their 2 young daughters. 8 of the defendants have been accused of carrying out deep cover assignments in the U.S. on behalf of Russia. Their mission, according to court papers, was to search and develop ties in policy-making circles. During a long-term FBI investigation, U.S. officials intercepted a message from Russian intelligence headquarters meant for 2 of the suspects. The note reminded the agents that their education, money, and homes were meant to serve one goal: gather information and send it back home to Moscow. Foreign agents are supposed to notify the Attorney General before working in the U.S. And if the alleged spies are found guilty of breaking that federal law, they could get up to 5 years in prison. 9 of the 10 defendants have also been charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering. That charge carries a maximum sentence of 20 years.
They had no idea that Gennady Veselenko was a master spy who had been responsible for 2 of the biggest cases in recent years in the United States, Bob Hansen and Rick Ames. And Gennady Veselenko had been involved in the identification of both of those long-term Russian moles. So that's a humiliation. And it's a humiliation because Putin and his colleagues have this intelligence background. They feel it very personally. And it was Putin himself who welcomed home the 10 illegals and feted them and went on television with them and sang songs with them of a patriotic nature. That is a humiliation.
If you remember, we mentioned earlier when we talked before the program about the legacy of families who were working for SIS in the Middle East. Can you elaborate this phenomenon?
Yes, one of the fascinating things about the Secret Intelligence Service is that some of the staff are almost more foreign than they are British. A very good example is George Blake, who was born in Holland, spoke many languages, including Russian, and he worked for the Secret Intelligence Service. And the Secret Intelligence Service has a tradition, particularly across the Middle East, of employing as staff officers people of a merchant background. And there are some famous families, like the Whitall family, like the Seychelles family, where there have been 3 generations. So father, son, and grandfather have all been SIS officers. And the Whitall family in particular, there is always a Whitall in SIS, and they have some connection with Turkey. And the Lafontaines, another trading merchant family in the Middle East, very well known. And there's always been a Lafontaine in SIS.
Speaking about SIS activities in the Middle East, can you tell us about SIS activities at the period of 2 decades before revolution in Iran? Because they established an office in Iran with the agreement of the Iranian government with some conditions.
I know nothing at all about the early operations of SIS.
No, not early, late actually, in 1970s.
No, I'm afraid I know very little about that. But I'm willing to write a book on the subject. But it's worth taking note of this.
But they had a condition to not connecting the opposition.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm with you. It is true that during the period of the Shah, that the Secret Intelligence Service was allowed to operate in Tehran and had a station at the embassy, and the station commander was declared to the regime, and they were allowed to operate on one condition, and that was that they do nothing to contact the opposition. And under normal circumstances, in the British system, SIS will run a station in a host country, and usually it's in a liaison capacity. So they would be liaising with the local intelligence or security apparatus, SAVAK in the case of Tehran. They would have a relationship, they would exchange information, they would help each other out, but they would be declared, and then they might run joint operations where they found a mutual interest in a particular adversary. So, for example, in 1938 in Germany, the British Secret Intelligence Service station commander in Berlin was declared to his German hosts. And he liaised with the Gestapo and exchanged information that was of mutual interest actually against the Soviets. So they will find a common bond. So
Even at the time of Hitler.
That was at the time of Hitler, which gives you an indication that you're prepared to deal with whoever your host is. But it is a mistake to believe that the SIS station will operate against the host country. It has never done that.
That's why they were not allowed to contact the opposition groups.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But it is worth saying that SIS in a host country will write reports about local conditions and what is going on.
You also had some position in intelligence organizations in the United States. Can you tell us about your experience?
Yes, I spent 10 years at the Counterintelligence Center in Washington, D.C., and this was teaching middle-ranking CIA officers and other intelligence agency personnel before they go for a promotion. So in order to get to a more senior rank, they had to be certified in counterintelligence. And I was just simply being used as a reference book describing operations. And so what often happens is that a case officer is posted overseas and they have somebody who comes to see them and says, I have information that I would like to give to your agency. Immediately, the case officer is very excited because this is potentially a very important source of information that policymakers have a priority for. Unfortunately, it may be a dangle, it may be a double agent, it may be a provocation. There are all sorts of possibilities, and so by going on one of these courses or reading one of my books, you realize that everything has happened before. And it's just simply a matter of recognizing what kind of case this is. And by acknowledging that there is a strong possibility that you are not in control, but rather you are the target, prevents a lot of tears at bedtime.
This is another question about the difficulties of different parallel security organizations or organizations working in intelligence in United States. That's from nearly 20 organizations.
Is it 43?
Or 43. I didn't know about that. 43. And some of these organizations have overlap in their duties.
Yes.
And what about in other countries, especially in the United Kingdom? Is there any problem, such problem here?
Well, the Americans tried to solve their problem by creating the Department of Homeland Security. So the Coast Guard, for example, had its own intelligence agency. Border Patrol had its own intelligence agency. So these are all, a lot of them have now been combined together in the United States, and they think they've fixed their particular problem, except they've all got computer systems that are not compatible with each other. But setting that aside, in Britain, we operate in a very different way because the principal intelligence agencies, so that's the Defence Intelligence Staff, MI5, Security Service, SIS, MI6, and GCHQ, they all supply their information to a separate body, which is the Joint Intelligence Committee, which sets the priorities and analyzes the product. So whereas in America and in many other countries, intelligence agencies conduct their own analysis, issue their own reports, we don't do that in this country. So we bring together the various different components of the intelligence agencies so that you get a lowest common denominator. All the agencies will sign off on a particular report that has been produced by the Joint Intelligence Committee. So SIS and GCHQ and MI5 do not have their own separate analysis capability in competition with each other. It all goes through the same channel.
One of the interesting points in your studies and publications that I found that you are trying, you manage to convince both wider and public audience as well as the selected and specialist audience and readers. That is very important achievement because normally the writers lose one side to other one. Can you explain about this skill?
I'm not sure that it's a skill, but I think it's a responsibility to make to demystify intelligence and make it available for the general reader. But on the other hand, being able to have sufficient detail and to acknowledge and respect authentic information so as to retain the support of the intelligence professionals. So I hope that my books are as attractive to the intelligence community itself as much as it is the general reader who wants to be able to learn a little bit more detail about the intelligence community when they are on the beach or on a flight.
Can you tell us what is your current research and your future publications, if you want?
Yes, the book that I'm working on at the moment is a very big project. I hadn't realized how big it was going to be, but it's in effect an analysis of documents that have recently been declassified that change our view of the Second World War. So hitherto, our view of German intelligence during the Second World War is that they were inept, incompetent, and maybe corrupt, and suffering a great deal from nepotism and good old-fashioned bribery. The reality is very different, and I found that a huge number of German intelligence officers were interrogated at the end of the Second World War, and these intelligence reports have never been declassified until recently. And so they weren't available to be seen. And what it demonstrates is that actually the cadre of Abwehr officers posted overseas were highly professional. And many of them were police officers or lawyers or had a long background in the intelligence community. and in many respects completely outperformed their allied counterparts. I mean, that was certainly true in Portugal and Spain, which was a front line for the intelligence community during the Second World War. So I've written, and I will publish in 2 volumes, a big history of German intelligence.
Thank you very much, Mr. West. Nice to have you.